Welcome to another episode of SummitCast. Today we're going to be talking about a very important subject, which is police reform. Welcome to another episode of SummitCast. Today actually happens to be the first day of the Derek Chauvin trial in Minneapolis, so a very important subject at the moment in America is police reform. And we have with us today a guest, Deirdre Burrell, who for 12 years was a police officer in the city of Chicago. So welcome, Deirdre. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, both of you.
So I'd like to start off by asking, you grew up in Chicago, I guess, in the time of the civil rights movement. So what was that like?
Well, I was young. But I can remember that everything was segregated, and you knew where you could not go and where you could go in Chicago. Mm-hmm. There was territorial areas in Chicago. For an example, if you crossed certain streets, you could not live in that particular area back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Mm-hmm. And if you were found there, there may have been some violence brought about on you for being in those neighborhoods. As children, we learned very quickly where we could go and where we could not go, and what we could do and what we could not do in public. Mm-hmm.
And you had segregated facilities like public transport and things like that at that point?
No. By that time, they were not segregated. However, you knew that you were safer if you stayed in your areas. Mm-hmm. You could get on the bus, public transportation, and as long as you were in the neighborhoods that were safe, you were okay. For an example, I remember when I was a young girl, my mom put my daughters and I on the bus, and she told me, when you get off the bus on Halsted at 75th Street, please make a right turn and go east to Eggleston. Well, in Chicago, when you're on Halsted, that was like a dividing line at that particular time. Mm-hmm. Western is another street that was a dividing line. In California, you definitely were in no man's land, so to speak. As children, we were never to go over that far west. And instead of me taking a right turn and going east, I ended up going west. Oh. And I went all the way to California, believe it or not, which is like 3-4 miles away from walking with my 2 young sisters in the snow. Yeah. And this elderly white guy saw me finally on California. He stopped me. "Young lady, where are you going?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I think I'm lost. I'm looking for Eggleston." He had never heard of the street Eggleston. Wow. That's just far remote, we were at that particular time, and where you lived and where you didn't live. Mm-hmm. So he hadn't heard of the street, but he said, "I think you need to go back in the other direction." Yeah. So that's what I ended up doing. But there were some young white boys that decided to have fun. Mm-hmm. They picked up some snowballs and put some rocks in those snowballs and threw them at my sisters and I. And I remember getting hit. And I just kept telling my sisters, "Keep walking. Don't look back. We just got to keep walking." We couldn't run because I knew if we ran, they probably would run after us. But I had to act like we weren't afraid, even though we were being plummeted with the snowballs.
With the rocks.
With rocks, yeah. Yes. That's what I grew up with.
Wow.
It sounds so much more primal, this idea, like as a child knowing where you're safe and where you're not safe. It's kind of like, the mother lion telling their cubs stay in the tall grass because if you go over here, bad things happen, or if you go over there. And the boys, the same thing, having this, I don't know how playful it was or if it was just purely malicious, but it just sounds so much more primal.
Snowballs might be playful, but
exactly.
rocks is not playful.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Well, I have a friend who went to Nepal, and his experience was, he said that the children, they were on a trek, like a 14-day trek through the mountains, and he said the children there would play by throwing rocks at each other. That was their fun. He said it seems so much closer to like a primal nature as far as life and death was so much more close and palatable for them. That they would throw rocks at each other and get hit and laugh because they got hit by a rock. You're like, that doesn't sound.
Wow.
Yeah, so I don't know.
Well, it was not fun. It was not fun.
It sounds terrifying, actually.
Yeah.
It was a little terrifying. Here I am with my 2 young sisters, and we're already lost. And then here's these young boys that decide that now they're going to have fun and whatever else they decided in their minds. But, that was the kind of thing. Same thing with stores. Back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There's certain neighborhoods where the stores, you did not go to certain stores. You just you stayed within your neighborhoods, and when things began to change over the years, and they began to put more malls in areas, you would find us slowly venturing, us meaning African Americans, slowly venturing off into these department stores and into the malls and whatnot. But it was truly a test, truly a test.
Yeah. So when you were growing up, it wasn't so much a legal segregation as it was but there were social rules that were really enforced.
They were very much enforced. You knew. Now I went to an integrated high school, but it was like 95% white and 5% black at that particular time, because the neighborhood that my mom and father was able to build a house in, and my mom is still there, believe it or not, over 60 years now in that same house. The neighborhood has completely changed. At the time, and I'm going to say this, but this was what was said by one of the prominent leaders in Chicago when people moved to that particular area, because not too far away, maybe a mile away, was Beverly. And Beverly in Chicago is, and still is, a predominantly white area, even though it's pretty integrated now with African Americans, Hispanics, Chinese live in that area if they choose to. But the area that my mom and dad built their home in was considered a mink-coated ghetto, because you had a little money, you could buy a house, build a home, but right a mile away was Beverly. So this predominantly, I should say, prominent black leader was letting us know, just because you could move out of the ghetto, meaning, the deeper inner city ghetto, does not mean you're out of the ghetto. You're still in the ghetto. It's just now considered a mink-coated ghetto because you could buy a house.
Wow.
I mean, that was the kind of thing that we grew up with.
Yeah.
And that's from a leader of the black community.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
But that's also, not only did it affect housing, but insurances and the way police policed. So if you had a home or wanted to get car insurance, depending upon where you lived, your insurance was going to be higher if you lived in predominantly black or Hispanic neighborhoods versus if you lived in white neighborhoods. And the way police policed back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, 80s even, was also different. And I would imagine, and I can't speak for post-90s because I wasn't part of the police department past 1995. However, I can just imagine that there's still the differences in predominantly white neighborhoods, how police versus how black officers are policing in their black neighborhoods versus how they would police in white neighborhoods, or vice versa.
So what's the difference? What was the difference?
Well, one of the differences is the mindset. You're going to automatically think, if you got a call in a black neighborhood that there's violence or some kind of destruction, even if it was a domestic disturbance, your mindset was you were going to take somebody out of there, meaning you were going to arrest someone. versus going in to try to make peace. Whereas in a white neighborhood, the same domestic disturbance, the man's drunk, or he's claims the wife claims he's violent, there would be discussion. He might be asked to leave the house, go cool off, go stay at a neighbor's or a relative's house overnight, versus in the black neighborhood, the man would automatically be arrested.
Was that entirely racial, or like if you went to a really poor white neighborhood, would it be more like you'd arrest someone there, or was it?
Poor white didn't matter.
Really? Wow.
Really, no. There's definitely a difference in the way you police, depending upon the neighborhoods that you're in.
So it was less class-based and definitely more clearly race-based.
Yes. Yeah.
And did that extend to the Hispanic? Was there a Hispanic population at that time?
The Hispanic population was pretty much centralized in a pocket at that particular time back in the 60s and 70s, a very small pocket in Chicago. Now it's totally different. One of the things that you may know about Chicago, it's a mecca for all different types of types of people that move in. They can be Hispanic, they can be Lithuanian, they can be Polish, they can be Chinese, and they have areas where they go to live.
Right.
And that's the segregation part in Chicago. They can be Italian, they can be Irish, and this area that I was talking about back in the 70s when my sisters, 60s when my sisters and I were not supposed to go that way, you had your Irish population over there. The
Irish
whites.
neighborhood.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So, what inspired you to join the police force?
What inspired me? Well, this to make that story as short as I possibly can, it was sort of a guided, intuitive kind of thing. I had graduated from college, but I needed to find a job right away to pay off student loans. And this particular job, at that particular time in Chicago, you really didn't need to have a college diploma. You needed a high school diploma. And because I still owed money on my tuition, I was able to say, okay, well, I could use my high school diploma versus my college education for this application. And I remember standing there saying, well, I want to go into my field, which was biology, microbiology and all these other areas that were open at that particular time, but they needed to have the college degree, and you had to be able to prove it. So long story short, I took the test, and I did well on the test, and the rest is history. That's how it happened.
So you weren't trying to,
No. I remember standing there having this conversation in my head like, do I really want to fill out this application?
Yeah.
I don't want to be the police. And I remember that little still voice saying, yeah, but you don't have to have your college degree to do this. You just have to pass the test, and you could pass the test, right? And I said, yeah, I could pass the test. I'm having this conversation with myself, and so that's how I ended up being on the force.
Okay, and so what was the training like?
Training was intensive. You have the law, and you have to learn the law. You have to learn all the laws. You have the physical, oh my goodness, the physical training. And if you were like some of us, we might have thought we were in shape, but then they take it up several notches. I remember having to climb this 6-foot fence. Wall.
Okay.
In training,
Wow.
you had a 3.5-foot, 4-foot wall you had to get over. You also had a 6-foot wall you had to get over. And you had an obstacle course that you had to go through. And I remember in my group, there was 3 different groups of police classes. And my particular class, I was the last one to try to pass this. And this was my third time. You only get 3 times, and that's
wow.
it. And then your whole class fails if you don't pass.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
So it was a big pressure, right?
Yeah.
So my class was cheering me on. Well, I know they were cheering me on for several reasons. You know,
course.
some of it was because they wanted me to pass, of course,
Yeah.
but their own personal interest was also involved.
Yeah.
And I remember having to practice doing push-ups and sit-ups. And I went to one of my supervisors and I asked him, how can I pass this test? I can't get over the wall. He says, Burrell, you gotta build up your upper body strength. You gotta do more sit-ups and push-ups, and,
Right.
you know.
So I guess you got over the wall.
I got over the wall.
I don't know. I'd have trouble getting over a 6-foot wall. That sounds hard. Wow.
So was there anything in the training about like race relations or affirmative action or any of that stuff in there?
Yes, vaguely I remember there was, and we had what they call psychological training also, and what you should and should not do, or how you not to be afraid to go into various areas or deal with certain circumstances. But I think after maybe 10 or 12 years, 20 years after I went through training, they became more involved in the affirmative action aspect and race relations and how to deal with race relations in various neighborhoods, in various cultural situations.
What was the population of the police, like the race of your fellow police officers? I mean, was it?
Well, at
Pretty
the time
mixed?
that no.
No.
At the time, you take a 12,000 police force, we'll say, and maybe 1,000, 2,000 officers were either African American, Hispanic, female. It was a very, very small group at that particular time of African American men and women, Hispanic men and women on the force.
So that's lower than the minority population in Chicago as a whole.
Yes.
I don't know what that would be.
Yeah. Well, back then it was different. There was still a larger population of whites back in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Things have changed now with most of the jobs going out to the suburbs.
Yeah.
You have more. Now it's moving again. It's shifting again where more whites are moving back into the city.
So what was your class? Was your class kind of fairly racially mixed?
It was. It was racially mixed. There may have been 1 or 2 Hispanics in the class versus, I'd say maybe 15 blacks, and the rest of the class out of 35, 40 people would have been white.
Okay.
Okay. And were relations between all the people were in the class, were they good? Were there any prejudice there?
You know what? For the most part, because we had to learn how to work with one another, there were certain dynamics, but I think those dynamics were more with the men, being territorial and who could outshoot who and,
Right.
That kind of thing. But because we learned quickly that it was important for us to be able to get along and have, quote unquote, each other's back, as they would say, you quickly got over that. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess you get to see people as you get to know them, rather than as the stereotypes that you.
Right. And you knew that this individual was going to be your brother or your sister out there in the field, and you would want to have them, and you would want to know that they were there to also protect you as you were to protect them. Now, did that happen once we got out there and you went to your different ways? Because all of us went into different departments or different districts. We had different training officers, and depending on your field training officer and how he or she was, how they policed and their own psychology would determine how you would learn how to police. And then you would have to determine from there on your own how you would be as a police officer.
So what did you, what was your experience with like the police force in general after you graduated? Was there, racial prejudice in the force or?
Oh, yes. And being a female, and at that particular time, there weren't many females in a district. On my particular watch, the police force is broken down into watches, meaning you worked so many hours a day, just like you would call it a shift.
Yeah.
We called it a watch. And that particular watch, I was the only female on the watch.
Wow.
Yeah. And in some districts, you may have only had back there in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you may have only had maybe 4 or 5 females in the entire district.
So what did you, what problems did you see with the way the police treated minorities, treated blacks and Hispanics and so on? Did you see issues with that?
Yes, I saw quite a few. Well, let me put it this way. You saw it and you had to deal with it, but you knew that you couldn't, there was not too much you could do about it because it was systemic. And so rather than try to fight against the establishment, you tried to figure out your own survival techniques that you needed to have within the establishment. So you saw quite a bit of it, not only with race, but also gender. When I came on the force, females didn't have a locker room. You changed in the bathroom or you wore your uniform to and from work. And the females fought very hard to get their own space, their own locker rooms, and to be able to work certain positions within, the unit or the department. Like you didn't see for a long time females working the desk. That was considered a plush position where you received the people as they came in, and you didn't have to go out to the field in a beat car.
Yeah.
That's what they call working the desk.
Yeah.
And so to get those positions wasn't easy at all. And I understand that a lot of it was based upon, once the unions got really, really entrenched, a lot was based on seniority. So, of course, the senior officers were usually the male whites that had been on.
Just because they've been there longer.
Exactly.
Yeah. Did you see kind of issues of police, like misconduct, of treating people badly?
Yes, I did. Yes. That's something I think you have to look at it this way. It wasn't something that was a majority with officers. Most officers go into a situation wanting to come out without having to arrest someone, without having to get into any kind of fisticuffs, fights, or anything to that nature. They would prefer resolving something peacefully. However, there were a few officers, especially back in the 70s and 80s, that came from that post-Vietnam era that were on the forces, and or those that had this racist upbringing, and they were outliers. They weren't the norm, but they did make it challenging for the rest of us, at times, because of their manner in which they would go in escalating situations versus trying to diffuse situations.
And that would be they'd be more likely to do that if it was black people than white people?
I can't say. I worked in a predominantly black community, but I've talked to other officers that worked in predominantly white communities that were black, and you could see that the escalation would be more with those that were non-white. It didn't matter if they were Hispanic, black, Chinese. It didn't matter. There may be some escalation.
When you said post-Vietnam War, was that like Vietnam vets who came
Yes.
and joined the police force, and
Yeah.
they'd been trained in the kind of like take out the enemy is the job? Is that what it was?
Well, I don't know if it was take out the enemy as much as it was maybe psychologically. They should not have been on the job, but because they did have this, they were vets, and vets were given that
Yeah.
consideration.
They had like a PTSD or something still.
I would believe so, yes.
Yeah.
It seems like that's a big issue in police reform today that they've talked about, is this idea that sometimes police, having seen so much, having witnessed shootings or seen so much violence, that it affects them to the point where they're no longer capable of doing the job, that like PTSD or whatever it is, and that psychological evaluation needs to be more prominent.
And there is, and they do have to go through psych evaluations after a shooting or after a very violent situation. However, most police officers know that if they say too much or do something out of the parameters of whatever that psychological test is,
Right.
they'll have their shield and gun taken away from them.
Right.
And that's the last thing they want, even
Yeah.
though they know they need help.
Right. There's no reason to be honest and no reason to seek help, because it just makes them not have a job anymore, basically. Yeah.
Right. And so what they began to do was in the counseling divisions of most police departments was to have people come in and help them, help all police officers, rather than pinpointing one specific person that may have an issue. They all would have to go through certain training every year that would be effective in helping them with counseling. And then they would be offered counseling, offered psychological counseling or help where it would be confidential, and the police departments would not report this to their supervisors, or it wouldn't even go in their medical records
Well,
if they asked for help. Unless
you got to have confidentiality for
Right.
counselling to really be effective, because
Right.
unless you can talk about the real issues,
Right. And I remember working for many years with the police department. Once a month, I would go and offer meditation and relaxation techniques to them. And this was like an in-service where they were mandated by their bosses that they'd have to come.
Yeah.
And for 2 days, they got an opportunity to be away from their unit, be around other police officers from around the city, and they were able to, just relax and get information, laugh, and, have a different environment that helped them. And a lot of them would come back year after year.
You offered meditation as part of that?
Yes, I did. For police officers, stress management. I have certification in stress management and relaxation techniques that I studied at one of the universities in Chicago. So I put that to use with the department. I remember taking this information to my bosses years before I was able to actually get into this particular unit and work with them. And it was like, can you imagine having a police officer meditate and then he or she has this visualization in their mind of going home and shooting up their family, but it's okay because you told them to meditate? So they they immediately said, no, this is not going to work. We're not going to do that. But years later, they realized, after looking at other departments, that you needed to do something that was out of the box, that was going to help police officers begin to handle their own stresses, no matter what they were involved in and engaged in, something that could happen immediately that they could use to help relieve some of that stress that they were under.
Yeah, I've seen studies about meditation and like mindfulness techniques where it actually even changes the physical structure of the brain. Right. They can see it in MRIs, and what it does is it enables the conscious mind to stay in control even in very stressful or emotional situations.
Absolutely. Police officers do a fantastic job in the moment, right there in the moment. They can handle it. Their adrenaline, it goes sky high. Unfortunately, what I've seen over the years is, and what you see on television, unfortunately, is where they can't come down fast enough to make the right decisions. If, for an example, what's the difference in shooting someone once or twice versus 16 times?
Right.
You think about that.
Right. That was an officer that was recently found guilty, right? He shot I think it was an unarmed individual 16 times, and nobody else who was at the scene fired a single shot. None of the other officers.
Yes.
And they were like, well,
right.
something seems to be wrong here.
Exactly. I believe, and I don't know if they've done any work on this yet, but I've said it over the years, a lot of these younger officers played these video games starting as kids. Think about it. And this is a reprogramming in the brain where you're sitting there, and the faster you can go and the more you can add up the points, the higher you go in this ranking, and this is part now of their subconscious.
Yeah, and that kicks in a stressful situation when the conscious mind is kind of shut down because of the stress.
Right, exactly. So I don't know if they're looking into that yet, but that is definitely something that I do believe that they need to. And again, going back to reform, that's an internal kind of thing that each department needs to look at. Each officer and see what has happened over the years with this particular officer. Is there a track record of violence, or have there been a lot of complaints against this individual? That's an internal departmental kind of reform that could be done versus having legislation dictate or other departments, city departments dictate how a police department should.
Like procedures,
Yes, exactly.
It seemed very uncomfortable to me when I was hearing that they were talking about, from a legislative perspective, actual, what chokeholds or what holds are allowed and what are not. It seemed like the police would be the best judge of how to actually detain someone safely.
Yes.
And that, a lawmaker in Washington, D.C. probably doesn't know a whole lot about that.
No, not at all. And that's what needs to be looked at. So when you're looking at reform and legislation, and you're talking about having each department within the city have a say in that, then how can the police?
Right.
Yeah.
How effective are they going to really be? Now they're becoming social workers. And I think there's a place for social workers. There's a place for psychologists. And I believe that there's a place for police. Law enforcement.
Yeah.
Law enforcement. I mean, that's the only reason why they're there, more than likely, is to enforce the law, because someone is violating that and violating somebody else's right.
Yeah, I've heard that some of the most dangerous calls that police go on are the domestic disputes. These things that others might say, oh, well, you should send a social worker or somebody in there who can talk to these people. It's like, well, if one of them gets upset and has a gun and shoots back at that person, it's not going to go well.
No,
Who are the
not.
social workers going to call? They're
Right,
going to call the police.
Right.
Maybe if there were police there and then they call the social worker and say, okay, the scene is relatively safe. Let's try to de-escalate this.
Well, see, what normally happens is if an officer comes upon a scene where someone has a gun, he or she has been trained to protect the rights of those innocent individuals first.
Yeah, for sure.
So that means having to annihilate the perpetrator. Now, what does that look like to a citizen that has his cell phone? You know, he or she comes upon this. Automatically, it looks like the police is being violent or there's police brutality. But he or she has been trained to protect the rights of the innocent people first. Right. So how do you do that if someone has a gun or someone has a knife and they are they're not listening to stop, put the gun down, put your hands up. They're not listening to that.
Yeah.
Then what do? You know?
Yeah, you've got to have some way to bring the situation under control and protect the innocent people who are around.
Right, exactly. And so it looks differently. Every situation is different. I've gone on domestic disturbances where you can go to the same house repeatedly. But the worst thing that an officer can do is think that this situation is the same as it was yesterday.
Right.
You know,
It's kind of a hopelessness that you're not really helping the situation.
right. But you have to be on guard that it may have escalated, you know, and you don't know that. But so every situation needs an officer that can think and then can respond or react appropriately. And that, again, goes back to internal training. And when police officers are under a lot of stress, like they were, for an example, we use Portland for an example.
Yeah.
Those police officers worked almost 24 hours, you know, nonstop for how many months?
Yeah.
You know,
And Molotov cocktails and rocks and, you know.
Right. So, and what can you do when the camera is on you and you've got people saying that there's police brutality, but they're supposed to stand there, and now they're the ones getting the rocks thrown at them. You know, going back to the childhood thing. You know, and they're being spit at and all kinds of things. What do you do? And that's not part of the job.
Yeah.
But we, meaning officers, take that on and make it part of the job. But then they have to go home and they have to try to come back into some type of normalcy themselves in their own lives. And that's hard to do.
Yeah.
You know? So when you're looking at, is there a need for police reform? Yes, there is a need for police reform. However, it's not from just a cut and dry, black and white. This is the legislation. This is what you need to do, and we want you to do it this way. We want to defund you, meaning we want to take the money from you and put it into social services, and so how is that helping people to take the money away from the police departments, and the police then already have low self-esteem. They already are overworked and understaffed. Less police officers in the field now than ever before. Right. And you want to take more money away, but you want the same policing or better.
Right.
Doesn't make sense.
No.
I think you said it best with this, the focus on training. I remember Jocko Willink, internet, I guess, personality, and former Navy SEAL. He said that when he was in the Navy, in the SEALs, that they trained 20% of their time. That 20% of their time in the military was spent in training. And then the other time they were either deployed somewhere doing things. But he said how important it is to have that 20% rule for police in America. That he felt that would really increase the safety for everyone involved in the interactions between people.
He's right. Yeah. Absolutely, it's the training, and it's being able to have those officers go back periodically for more training, and I was of the mindset that every police officer he or she should stay physically fit. I don't know how the departments are today, but years ago, after you got out of training, your initial training, and you became a 5-year vet, more than likely going back into the range, for an example, just to stay sharp, you only did it when you needed to go and recertify. Same thing with physical exercise. You became less and less able to run up 3 flights of stairs. Yeah. And so what did policing look like at that particular time when you now have to jump out of a car and you're a 15, 20-year vet?
Yeah.
Versus when you were a 3 to 5-year vet. But the training, I think, is important all throughout your entire career.
Yeah. Something that occurs to me, is that training in like de-escalating situations would be useful. Were there police officers who were like better at going into a situation and talking it down rather than escalating it?
Yes, there were. First of all, in most departments you have the negotiators. Mm-hmm. They may be part of the hostage terrorist negotiating teams.
Yeah.
But then you had those that were in the police department in Chicago. They wore blue uniforms, so the blue shirts. Those the grunts out there in the field. You had to have people that could come into the neighborhoods. It didn't matter what color they were, and you had those. Didn't matter what color they were, they could get along. The kids liked them, the grandmamas liked them, and they would be offered pie and cakes and donuts and coffee or whatever it was because they had the personality to get along with people. I would say, speaking spiritually, they were more heart-centered, even though they were wearing a uniform. Mm-hmm. I remember before the CAPS, which was the community policing, became a unit in Chicago, you had the neighborhood police officers that policed the neighborhoods. These were those more heart-centered individuals that got along with and found out what was going on in the neighborhoods.
Right. They would be able to get more information as well to know if there's any kind of illegal activity because they would be seen as a trusted person in the community. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, some people have that naturally. Do you think that's something you can help people with training?
That's what the CAPS unit was for. In fact, I was considered the social worker in my unit, in my district.
You were the hard person, right?
Yeah, I was the hard person.
It's not hard to do.
I would go to court, and the people that I would have arrested would have said, "Officer Burrell, good morning. How are you today?" And the judges and the police, other police officers would look at me like, "They don't say that to me."
So how were you viewed in the black community as a black police officer? Was there any kind of animosity or?
You know what? That's a good question because yes, I was now the enemy, and within, it depended on your age. If you were over 40, 50 years old, then I was looked at as a hero, even if I didn't do anything heroic, because I had a very nice job, a good job. I was, respected in the neighborhood. But then the little thugs and
the little thugs didn't like you.
So I remember it took me a while to let people know that I was a police officer in my own neighborhood. Okay. Because again, how would I be looked at? Yes, and that is something, some people respect you, and at that particular time, anyway, the respect also meant that they would do what you asked them to do, versus the belligerence that you see today, where there is no respect, no fear of the police, whatsoever. Yeah.
What do you think's caused that?
I think that believe it or not, has to go back to how people are raised. it's the same thing with teachers. They're not respected today. And so when you don't bring up a child to respect authority, to respect their position of someone that's there to help you, that begins the belligerence, that begins the disrespect and the defiance, and that continues. And then if you don't have those in the neighborhood that's going to help to deter that in a constructive way, and everyone is getting, or I shouldn't say everyone, but instead of having departments that can funnel this young-minded individual that is now taking hubcaps off the car and teach him at an early age something constructive that he can do, then what is he going to do if he's looked upon in his neighborhood as he's now the hero instead of the police officer being the hero in the neighborhood? And so he grows up going from taking hubcaps to stealing cars, and then it goes from there on and on. So I believe it starts in the house, in the home. I really do.
I mean, something that occurs to me is the rhetoric you see, like defund the police, and the police is systemically racist, and America's systemically racist, and if you're a black person, you're going to be a victim of racism all of your life. It seems like that's actually kind of exacerbating what you're talking about the distrust of the police and antagonism to the police, and that's kind of making the whole situation worse.
Yes, and television, the social media, that doesn't help the situations now either. It's a sad situation when a black child has to learn, and I would imagine Hispanic children have to learn at a very early age how to behave when you might be approached by a police officer, versus years ago, you felt that they would even come into the school. This is officer friendly, and you learned that this was officer friendly. Now it's like, this is officer, be scared of him because he or she may hurt you, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so what do you do? Even when I get stopped, and I'm a former police officer in certain areas of the country, I would behave differently than I would in other parts of the country. Like in the South, for an example, still to this day, I would handle myself differently. I would immediately let them know that I'm a former police officer, but that does not mean that they would respect me any differently, depending on where they are mentally. And it doesn't mean that I would not get the same kind of treatment if I was up north. So I think it really depends on the person and what's in them, what's in their makeup, what's in their psyche, what's their triggers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and always having respect. I know that's what my mom always said. I think because as a young child, I saw her get out of the car, or she got pulled over, and she opened the door and for whatever reason got out to talk to the officer. And the officer yelled, "Get back in the car! Get back in the car!" and had his hand on his gun. He didn't draw his weapon, but holding it and commanding her get back in the car. And she was like, "Oh, of course," and puts her hands on the steering wheel and the whole thing. And seeing that as a child, I was like, okay. And she said, "This is what you don't do, Noah. When the officer pulls you over, you put your hands on the steering wheel, yes sir, no sir, and have a great day, sir, or ma'am." And so I think I just wonder if that's not what we should be teaching everyone, that they don't have to be viewed as the enemy, but they have a really tough job. Every person who gets out of that car is probably, they have this percentage chance that that's going to cause them harm.
Right.
They're going to come out with a weapon, trying to hurt them. And so it's just understanding how difficult the job of a police officer is, and not giving them any reason to fear you or fear the situation they're going into.
It helps when you see that it's better for you to do these things up front.
Yeah, right.
It automatically takes the police officer's high alert down a notch.
Yep.
You know, he or she is still going to be on alert. They have to be. But it's not where you're escalating it by doing something, you know, some movement, or
Right.
you're trying to get out of the car, or you're saying foul language at him as he or she approaches the car,
Right.
you know, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, kind of getting back to police reform a little bit, I think one of the things is that there are people in the police force who really shouldn't be there. You know, I mean, we need to find a way to suggest to them that there's another line of work that might be more suitable to their character. So, and you talked about the unions with seniority and so on. One thing I've heard is that the unions make it hard in some cases to fire police officers who really, you know, shouldn't be there, who have a history of misconduct and treating people badly and so on. So have you seen that?
Well, I can't say I saw that where the union actually protected someone that needed to go. But I do know that police officers felt that they did have the union to back them if they were questionable in their behavior. Again, it depends on the department, how effective unions are. I know Chicago had a very, very strong union at one point. I don't know how it is today. And police officers felt that that was the only defense that they had, was their union, you know, to protect them in case that there were things that were questionable and that they were doing their job. Now, they also had an outside unit, internal affairs division, that would also investigate if there was a civil a complaint registered against the police officer. So the officer had the union and the union rep to immediately be there to support him or her in case there was something that was questionable, or in case there was a shooting or a homicide or whatever it may have been, that the police officer's actions might have been questioned until he or she could get their own legal defense. And then you also had the internal affairs division that was there if there was a civil complaint. And so the officer had to report to the internal affairs division and give a statement. Now, at one point, the internal affairs division in Chicago was police officers. I think it became more civilian at some point. The question with that is, do civilians know what they really need to know in regards to a police officer, or what is taking place, or what has taken place, and what needs to be investigated? So I think there needs to be a bridge between the two. I believe that a police officer still needs to have that union behind him or her, but at the same time, not to the point that if his or her behavior is so outlandish that he or she is still going to be protected and her job is going to be protected, and you can see that there was blatant neglect or abuse or whatever.
Did you see police officers who really were, you know, like bad apples in that way, who continued on and there wasn't a way to get rid of them?
I did see that there were officers that stretched the law when it came to how they policed. Breaking the law? No. Stretching the law, you know, and there's a thin line, but in a police officer's mind, again, we're talking in that particular situation, did I or did I not do what was necessary to bring about restraint or peace or diffuse the situation? So, that is a subjective.
Yeah.
Did you ever have to report on a fellow officer, or how was that viewed?
I'm smiling because I was a rookie, and I was called in on an IAD case because
What IAD is
Internal Affairs
Okay.
Division wanted me to testify or give a statement, I should say, because my name was mentioned. Here I am, the social worker again, and I saw this offender. He was handcuffed to the wall, which is customary, to keep the offender handcuffed, so he doesn't walk out of the room and just walk out the door. So you handcuff him. At that time, it was, in Chicago, you handcuffed him to the wall if you left the room. And I walked in this room, and he was there by himself. And so I guess he saw my name because I asked him, was some kind of casual conversation I had with him. And then later on, he was the one that had made a complaint against the two officers that had arrested him. And so I did have to testify. Well, make a statement. I didn't have to testify, but I did have to make a statement. Yes.
And were you comfortable doing that? I mean, was there a culture that...
No. You asked all the right questions. No, no, I was not comfortable at all.
Because you felt like you were just betraying your brotherhood, or just...
Well, there's a code of silence, and that is not talked about, but it's understood. You are not going to go against your fellow officer for an offender, somebody that has done something to break the law. And so what do? Do you turn your back on this if you see that your brother or sister crossed the line, so to speak? Do you turn your back, or do you report them? I think it's a personal thing that some officers today would not think twice about reporting another officer. Because again, as I was saying before the show, most officers today are very well educated. A lot of them some have doctorate degrees, some have most of them have masters now.
Wow.
But years ago, people right out of high school became police officers, and this was their life. This was their livelihood. This was who they were. They wanted to be the police, And so that code of silence was very strong, and you did not go against it at all. At all. So what did I do? I walked the middle way, in case anybody is interested and want to know. I did not lie on my fellow officers, and I did not embellish what the offender had said or didn't say, and I think the interviewer had to read between the lines, but I think he was able to read between the lines pretty effectively in the way I diplomatically handled that situation.
Yeah, it's a tough situation. You don't want to kind of have policemen going around and worrying if their partner or someone else is going to turn them in for some little innocent mistake they made, but then it can get to the point where it's used to cover up really bad stuff. My father-in-law was a police officer at one point. He'd been in the Army World War II, was a police officer, and he quit because the corruption in the police force. This was in Australia. And, the code was you couldn't, inform on anyone who was corrupt, and he just couldn't live with it. So he left and joined the ambulance service.
Yeah.
So, I think one of the things that is, and probably the number of bad police officers is really small who are really bad, and they end up on, viral videos on YouTube and on the news and so on, and it's, I think it creates an impression that's probably not accurate, that this is how police officers are in general, and that doesn't help at all. But then you have to have a way to get these people out of the police force before it's on YouTube,
Yeah.
before the really bad thing happens. When it's smaller things, where you see a pattern,
And that's the problem, because I don't know again today, because years ago, again, these officers in general that I'm referring to in generalities, some of them may have had connections. You may have had a brother or an uncle that was a supervisor, a chief or deputy chief on some of these departments, and he or she got you this job, and so you might have felt protected that way.
Yeah.
But today you're looking at, again, officers that don't have that history and don't have that alliance or allegiance to one another in that way. And I think the reporting of bad officers today is easier, even if it's done anonymously. I think that the allegiance to the code of silence is not as strong as it was many years ago, for various different reasons.
Yeah.
So, and I think police officers need to be given the benefit of the doubt, and social media and the media needs to also show the good things that police officers do.
Right.
I remember when the police were having a very, very hard time when I was on the force. I was about 7 years on the force by that time, and they were going through a bad stint, publicity-wise, and so was the fire department, with all kinds of different things going on. And there was an incident where I was now a dispatcher no longer in the field, but I was a dispatcher, and there was a baby that was choking, and the mother called, and by God's grace, to keep the story short, I was able, after the second call, she called back, I was able to help walk the mother through resuscitating her child until the fire department arrived.
Wow.
And I remember being called up to my supervisor, who was the chief at that particular, deputy chief at that particular time, because there was such bad publicity. They wanted me to know that they were going to take this story and use it to sort of shift the thoughts and the minds of people. And that wasn't said in so many words. It wasn't said like this, but after thinking about it in hindsight, it was like, oh, yeah, that's right. We were going through a bad period at that particular time. And, I ended up on the, the front page of the newspaper, and all kinds of different good publicity came out of that. And
I've seen a few videos like that come out recently, which have been encouraging to see. There was one that these police officers got called to a noise complaint because this group of young guys were practicing their music in the backyard, and some neighbour complained anyway, and the police officer ended up picking up the guitar and jamming with them. And I think, stories like that are really great, because it not only gives people a different view of the police, and the police are really here on your side, but it also gives police officers like a role model. How do you be that police officer who relates to people and who people like, and give him a cake and so on,
Right.
And that's really what's needed, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
And, we can talk about, there's things that need to be done with reform, I think. Better ways to remove officers who shouldn't be there. And, so, some of the bad cases that have come up, their officers had complaints against them before and, probably shouldn't have been around still. But one thing I think may come out of the George Floyd thing in the aftermath is that even people in the police realise that the price that the police forces pay for keeping these people on, can
It's
be
not
huge.
worth it.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's not worth it.
It's not worth it.
And it's worth it to get rid of these people, even
Right.
if you deal with some short-term grief with it.
Absolutely. I think that would be a good thing that would come out of it. As well as finding a way that police officers can, again, go back to defusing and the psychological training. I know the psychological training for Chicago may have changed, but during the time that I was a police officer, you got that initial training. And if it wasn't for the in-service training that you got years later, like I was saying about the stress management and the counseling services, realizing that they needed to do something, more of that needs to be done within all departments.
Yeah.
And it should be mandatory. It shouldn't be a voluntary kind of thing.
Yeah.
That an officer gets that kind of training every year, some type of psychological reevaluation if he or she has had a repeated type of offense or reports against them, and they escalate certain situations on the reports of escalation. What's going on with that individual? Are they experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yeah. Yeah, or are they running out of skills,
Right.
for de-escalating?
I feel like the badge cams might have helped improve that as well, because now you can instantly rewind. What did the officer actually say? How did you actually de-escalate the situation? Right. Instead of a he said, she said kind of a situation. Right. It's actually kind of increased my respect for police officers, because you see more of the interactions, or even if there's a questionable shooting and you see what they've actually been going through, and perhaps the suspect was yelling profanities and names and had the knife in their hand and whatnot, and you kind of get the entire scenario more than just a text rundown of this is what happened. Right. I feel like that it's definitely increased my respect for the job that they have to do every day, and I think it could also help with the training.
And that's taking place. Actually, supervisors are having to go back and learn how to handle the cameras and how they need to train their officers to act at all times, because they are going to be on camera. So what would you do in this situation?
Right.
Now the supervisor can actually see what he or she has done. Yeah. And he or she can then go to this officer with the proof. This is what you did. This is how it should have been done. Even if it's not something that's going to be reported, but just in the training within each unit, the supervisors are now, I think, going to have to step up too and do that.
And hopefully it's used most of the time not to find misconduct and punish people, but okay, this didn't go that well. Let's look at the tape and and what can we learn from it, and how could we have done it differently?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing I was going to say was that I've done mediation, and we had to do a certain amount of training every year to keep our certification. And you learn a lot in that training about how to de-escalate conflict. I mean, I would do family mediation. People are going through divorces, and some of them,
they can get pretty hot.
They can get really hot. I mean, just short of the ones where there's domestic violence, we wouldn't have people with domestic violence in the same room. But it could be getting close to that, and you have to find ways to listen and hear them and de-escalate and help them talk to each other. And that's a skill that can be learned and can be you can get from training. So I think training in police officers in those kind of things would be really valuable. It's not like, getting rid of the police and replacing with social workers isn't what you need, but you need probably police officers need more of those kind of skills as well as,
Absolutely. And I think that's what's happening with the more professional police officers coming on the jobs now. They have certain training or backgrounds, and they're able to be trained to be mediators or trained to be whatever the department needs.
Yeah.
And they're brought in. They may not be in every unit, but they are on call, and that's very helpful.
Yeah.
Very helpful, yes.
I guess the other thing that is talked about in police reform is the idea of the problem with qualified immunity, and that it's very hard to convict a police officer of misconduct, even for things that are really bad. And so one of the problems is that people see the video of somebody like the George Floyd situation, and we don't know how that trial is going to turn out. But in cases in the past, there's been really what looked like really bad misconduct, and probably was really bad misconduct, and yet the police officers were found innocent under the standards of qualified immunity. And my understanding is the precedent there is to convict someone, you have to show that they actually intentionally wanted to kill the person, for example. And there was some legislation proposed last year where they wanted to change that standard from willfulness to recklessness. And so, apparently now you have to show that the person intended to kill them, whereas if it's recklessness, you can just say they can be convicted for just behavior that was very reckless and could have been foreseen as leading to this person's death. The challenge with willfulness is you have to prove that the person intended to, and then you have to get in their head. What were they thinking?
Right.
Well, they say they didn't mean to.
Right. What was he thinking when he was holding his knee on the guy's neck for 9 minutes?
Exactly.
What was actually going on inside his head? Well, it's like, how do you know?
Yeah, and so if the standard was willfulness, he could get off. Chauvin could get off. If it's recklessness, then you're much more likely to see justice prevail in that situation.
Well, I would have to say, having been a police officer and also a civilian, there needs to be a balance. There needs to be a change in the laws. And I don't think changing it from willfulness to recklessness is a step down. Actually, it's a step in the direction of, again, each police officer needs to be held accountable for his actions, not his thoughts. Because, again, we don't know what his thoughts are. We don't know what his past behavior may have been. And if he's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, then maybe this will help each department do something differently internally to help this particular officer so that it doesn't escalate to recklessness. When one officer gets a person down on the ground, he or she is no longer a threat, especially if you have the handcuffs on.
Right.
So what's the point in kicking them at that particular point?
Right.
What's the point in hitting them with your billy club or your flashlight at that particular point? And definitely, what's the point in shooting them?
Right. Because now they're in your custody.
Yes.
Their life is your responsibility.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that, to me, is recklessness. Having been a former police officer, I would still stand on that, even on the job today as an officer. There is a point. You don't cross a certain line, period. Mm-hmm. And that's the way I policed. I felt everyone should be given, even if he or she were an offender, they have certain rights, and certain respect has to be put in place so that that person's rights are not neglected.
Yeah.
And if we allow our emotions, because there were situations where I could have definitely, bash somebody's head in based upon what I saw on the scene there.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, but you have to have certain restraint.
Yeah.
And you can't allow yourself to allow your emotions to take over. So what kicks in? What's the trigger when you see these officers that just can't stop shooting? You know, and he empties his gun. And then he's getting ready to reload. And, you know, that's definitely a psychological, somebody has snapped at that particular point.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, from a spiritual perspective, the law should reflect karma, you know. And so, if a police officer does something, you know, and someone dies, you know, they should be able to be convicted of misconduct if it was really reckless, you know.
right.
And and I think if people see that happens, I mean, people have a sense of justice, and if justice isn't done, then it undermines people's respect for the whole system of law and order and so on.
And this goes back to what you were asking earlier. What changed, what happened where police are not respected in the neighborhoods? It's because of that very thing. Meaning the neighborhood saw so many officers get away with things that were not lawful when they came to their neighborhoods. You know, you don't have to tear up a house. You don't have to beat somebody over the head and you have this person handcuffed. You know, you don't have to mistreat them once they get inside the room, the interrogation room. You don't have to mistreat that individual there. There's certain things that police officers have brought on themselves that has made it necessary that people stand up and say no more. You know, when officers years ago, I'm going back now, we're talking before civil rights, where a young man could be lynched, dragged down the street, and then hung, and the police did nothing, turned their back, or were a part of it.
Yeah.
You know, all of this became very distasteful in people's minds, even though even blacks even then still tried to respect the police as they recognized that the police, when they worked on their behalf, meaning in their neighborhoods for them. And that's why it was important for black communities to have black officers. There were black officers when they first got on, back in the 60s, 70s, even in Chicago, that were, you could see racism against them. Their post or their beat was an alley. You know, not a beat car where they could go out into the neighborhoods. Their beat was an alley. That's what they policed all day long, was an alley. When they, especially if they spoke out against racism or misconduct or whatever it may have been. You know, so there needs to be reform internally as well as externally.
Yeah, and I guess what we're seeing is because the reforms weren't handled internally, that then, you know, legislatures and so on are getting involved, and it seems like it's necessary. But the most important thing is that the culture within the police forces themselves changes so that they can take care of these things internally.
Exactly. That's going to be key, because again, it's just going to be a sort of like a pie that's a medley of something. If everyone gets involved, and the police internally, they no longer have authority to handle policing. And to structure how that looks. And someone outside of the agencies are now going to dictate how you should police. That's not going to be a good thing.
Yeah, you can't do the job, and because you're always worried about someone second guessing you and you know, saying you did it wrong and so on, and so you end up with this kind of, I mean, we're kind of hearing reports of that you know, police aren't responding to emergency calls and crimes and so on because they're afraid that if they get involved, they'll get accused of brutality or something, even if they do something that's you know, that's really necessary.
Right. And then with them wanting to defund or shift funds from the police departments to other agencies, now the very small policing that used to be done. For an example, beat cars going around and ticketing cars that were parked illegally. This was revenue for the different cities. So you're no longer going to have that officer get out and write these tickets. So you're going to depend on these traffic lights now that they're putting in most cities to be your traffic enforcement.
Yeah.
Which also takes away from that beat cop who used to walk the beat, walk into the neighborhoods, walk from store to store, and small businesses, and check things out and knew who was in the neighborhood. So you won't have that any longer.
Yeah. You don't have the relationships.
No.
Yeah.
So how did you feel when you watched, as a former officer and as Black, watched the George Floyd video? And I mean, did you have a reaction or?
Oh, did I have a reaction? Yes, I did. First of all, just being human.
Exactly.
And being a female, the mother instinct immediately kicks in.
Right.
And seeing this man on the ground crying and calling for his mother, no matter if he was high or whatever, I think I can just surmise that most people that know when they are in a situation like that, they may not make it. He may die. And we're looking at the life force leaving his body. And we're looking at this police officer that has no light, no nothing in his eyes, just this look that he's just going to stay where he is because he's in his happy place.
Right.
That did not go well with me at all.
Yeah, it was very hard to watch, wasn't it?
Yes, very, very hard to watch. And so what you saw was people not being in the teachings, not having the understanding of the karmic dynamic that was going on between those two men. And they maybe had and made an agreement that they were going to work it out some kind of way from previous lifetimes, but oops, they blew it again.
Again.
Yeah.
And to see this man lose his life, and to see this other one now on trial, what can he say? In reality, what can this police officer say? In my opinion, there's nothing to say except whatever you justice that you feel that I need to have. I have to own up to the fact that I did not hold to my pledge as a police officer, or my pledge as another human being to another human being.
Yeah. Yeah, and probably the arguments we made that technically this hold was legal and these kind of things, and there was nothing he did that was technically illegal. But it comes back to the fact that he's kneeling on this guy's neck, and he's no threat, and the guy dies when he's in his control.
Exactly.
So he's responsible for his death,
He is.
regardless of whether technically it was because of his knee or because of the drugs he had in his system.
Right.
And there's got to be some accountability for that. And I
Yes.
hope he can see it, and I hope he can admit it to the court.
Yes, I do too. And as we know, what does this mean for his soul?
Yeah.
For his soul. That particular lesson is so probably so far away from even a thought process for him.
Yeah.
But he's going to have time to think about it, I believe.
He's
I
going to
hope
meet
anyway.
George Floyd in a future life,
Right.
That's kind of
Right.
pretty much guaranteed how karma works, And
Yeah. Yes.
anything else before we wrap it up that we need to do, need to think about regarding police forces and police reform?
Well, it would be a good thing if more of them were like Miss Hooks. I don't know if you all ever saw Police Academy,
Oh, right.
I have not seen that movie.
Oh, there was about 4 or 5 of them, at least 4 police academy movies. But I was considered the Miss Hooks,
really?
in my unit. Soft spoken.
Yeah.
I was very effective, but I still treated people with respect. I'm going to handcuff you now. Now, if you took my kindness
For granted.
for granted, that's sorry for you. But
Yeah, you can still treat this person with respect and know
Right.
that you respect them as a person. They did something bad. They
Yes.
made a mistake, but
yeah,
we can still respect each other as people. And,
Right.
and
I had that in a
Right.
federal building. Had to go in recently, and there's the main security officer. He's been there every time I've had to go to this federal building, and he's got this really kind of gregarious and happy personality. Oh, how's it going? Hey, good to see you guys again. But then you have to go through the metal detector, and he gives the whole speech. And there was a young guy who I don't know if he'd ever been there before, but he comes in and he had just a little bit of attitude or something, and didn't want to have to take his jacket off or something like that. And all of a sudden, this guy who's always kind of gregarious and happy, he was like, okay, there's 2 ways this can go. The easy way and the hard way. If you want to go into this building, you're going to have to listen to everything I say and do exactly what I say. And the kid was like, yes, sir.
right.
And it was like, he had that switch where if he needed to,
Yes, exactly.
he could do exactly because he knew his job. He knew
Right.
it was the safety of this building.
Yes.
And he had the ability to flip that switch.
Right. Yeah.
It was great to watch.
Yeah. Yes.
And it's great that he could relate to people, the
Yeah.
rest of the time when
yeah.
that was appropriate.
I never had a single issue with him. He was a great guy. And,
Yeah.
I think trust. Police are going to have to be trusted again, and how that's going to show up, and what it's going to look like in the future for the teenagers today and the young people today, and trusting the police and respecting the police. I don't know, but it's going to.
Police need to really reach out in the community, don't they?
Yeah.
And in one sense, more funding is needed for that. I saw one person saying, if you cut funding, the first thing that goes is training.
Right. Yes.
Exactly.
Which actually makes the situation worse. So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah. So police force is actually getting out there and engaging with the community.
That has to go back to that. I mean, when the police department started the CAPS unit, the community policing, the crime went down for about 20 years, and then it started ticking back up again, and that's because, again, the environment changed. The police started pulling back in regards to protecting individuals from gangs. The gangs were taking over. And as when the gangs became more and more sophisticated, meaning they're now being funded from the sources outside of the United States coming into the United
The
States.
drug cartels and so
Yes.
on.
That changed how police were able to be effective in the communities. And
Yeah. The threat level they're facing is much higher.
right,
Yeah.
right. And the guns that the offenders have are much more powerful than the ones that the police have.
Right.
Sorry to say.
Changes the whole dynamic.
It does.
Yeah.
When your bulletproof vest is not bulletproof any longer,
Yeah.
or the offender's trained to go for the jugular. I mean, these things they're being trained, believe it or not. Offenders, gangbangers, are being trained to be very effective.
Yeah. Antifa, I saw a video of some, undercover, some person undercover recorded Antifa, people training, how to disable people, how to cause them maximum pain and so on. So it's definitely a different environment out there. I guess maybe the place to end is that police forces and policemen are supposed to be the representatives of Archangel Michael.
Yes.
And, they're the Blue Lightning Angels in embodiment. And some of them are, some of them are really, really wonderful.
Yes,
And
they are. And would give their life for
Yeah.
saving another. as
Yeah.
happened the other day when an officer lost his life
Yeah.
going into a crowded situation where shots were fired. So, yes, this happens every day. And I believe police officers, on a whole, 99% of them, when they put that uniform on, male or female, they know that they're out here to serve and protect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we call to Archangel Michael to overshadow them and bring about the changes that are needed within the police forces so that they really can be the representatives
Yes.
of him in the world.
Yes, absolutely.
So, Deirdre, thank you for joining us,
You're welcome.
and we'll see you on our next episode of SummitCast.